This is an audio review of Chapter 12, Intro to Sociology, Gender, Sex, and Sexuality. So before we jump into sex, gender, sexual orientation, how these things are socially constructed, and how they construct our everyday lives, we got to define all this stuff first, right? So sex refers to physical or physiological differences between males and females, including both primary sex characteristics or our reproductive systems, and secondary characteristics, such as height and muscularity. While gender refers to behaviors, personal traits, and social positions that society attributes to being female or male. So we live with a dichotomous view of gender called the gender binary. And so this is specific to certain cultures and is not universal, as we'll talk about. So just to back up for a second, sex is biological, gender is social. Right? So this is why when people say they're having gender reveal parties, they're not. They're having sex reveal parties. I guess it doesn't sound as good. Baby sex party. Anyway, but basically, when we're talking about sex and gender, a lot of people use them interchangeably, but they mean completely different things. Right? Sex is biological, gender is social. So when we look at how these things can be socially constructed, we know that in some cultures, gender is viewed as fluid. In other cultures, they accept a multitude of genders or 3 genders sometimes. So our view of gender as a dichotomy, as this or that, is definitely specific to our culture and not universal. So that shows it's socially constructed. Now, I know the book doesn't get into this. It's an intro class, but I can't help myself. I teach an entire class about gender. So I'll try to keep it brief today, but I won't. But anyway, sex, though, is also a binary. Biological sex. We assume that everyone is male or female, when in actuality, there's many of people that are born intersexed with mixed sexual characteristics, right? So maybe you're phenotypically female, but you have some male sex characteristics, or you're phenotypically male, you have some female sex characteristics. Some of these things are chromosomal issues, some are hormonal. It's pretty interesting that we're much more complex than this or that. And we have this assumption that XX female, XY male. And what's interesting is we think the Y chromosome is really what's responsible for the difference, though scientists would argue it's really how many X's you have that makes the difference. But anyway, so you can have symptoms or syndromes like Klinefelter's, where you have XXY as a genetic marker. So even sex is a binary in our society, right? We like to fit things into neat boxes. You're this, you're that. And so we assume a biological sex corresponds with gender. So if I'm born biologically female, then the assumption is that my gender will be female. But that's just not how sex and gender necessarily always work, right? Sometimes that path is not linear. So this is really our social construction, the way our society has deemed that these things work, more so than it being some sort of natural process, right? Even when we talk about, again, sex, when we know that people are born hermaphroditic, where they have both sex characteristics. So how do we fit them into a binary? The problem, though, is that in our country, and really around the world, but especially in our country, because of our cultural belief systems about this binary, we often force children to fit this binary. Meaning sometimes when children are born with mixed sex characteristics, what's the first thing we ask parents when they have a kid? Is it a boy or a girl? We don't understand that there could be another option. Even though there's more intersexed children that are born than children born with Down syndrome, but we know what Down syndrome is. With cerebral palsy, but we know what cerebral palsy is, right? But those things aren't stigmatized and they don't shake up the foundation of our society like sex and gender does. So basically what happens is a lot of these children are, basically doctors will convince parents to have these children undergo unnecessary surgeries in order to make their genitals more quote unquote normal to fit into the binary. So they can say, I have a boy or a girl. When again, forcing children over many years to have unnecessary surgeries on their genitals that has no medical purpose other than fitting them in a binary is incredibly toxic and problematic, but it does show how powerful our culture is in how we interpret something as biological, right? We can take something that's obviously biological by nature, someone born with mixed sex characteristics, and then erase that difference to fit the binary and say, there, the binary is real. It exists because we're forcing that existence, right? Okay, sorry, I'll just keep going if you let me. All right, sexual orientation. A person's sexual orientation is their physical, mental, emotional, and sexual attraction to a particular sex. So sexual orientation is typically divided into several categories. You have heterosexuality, attraction to individuals of a different sex or the other sex, as they do, again, in the binary, the idea of you're this or you're that, so there's opposites, right? Homosexuality is attraction to individuals of the same sex. Bisexuality is often attraction to individuals of either sex. Asexuality is a lack of sexual attraction or desire for sexual contact completely. This one, I think, is the one that's the hardest for a lot of students. Asexuality is often not discussed, so we don't realize that that itself is a sexuality. And again, I really have said this many times to students. Oh man, the things I could have accomplished in my life if I was asexual. Anyway, and then pansexuality is an attraction to people regardless of their sex, gender identity, or gender expression. So what's the real difference there between bisexuality and pansexuality? Well, if bisexuality is attraction to either males or females, pansexuality is attraction to people regardless of their gender identity or gender expression. So that could be attraction to someone who's male, who's female, who's trans, who's non-binary, right? Any of those categories. And then a little bit more terminology. Queer. This is an umbrella term used to describe sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. So heterosexuals and homosexuals are often referred to as straight and gay, respectively, but more inclusive terminology is needed. Proper terminology includes acronyms like LGBT or LGBTQ, right, which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or questioning. And I mean, you can add, IA and all sorts of other letters to this, but again, it's an intro class. We'll just kind of scratch the surface today. So, the United States is a heteronormative society. This means that many people assume heterosexual orientation is biologically determined and unambiguous, right? Consider that LGBTQ people are often asked, when did you know you were gay? But heterosexuals are rarely asked, when did you know you were straight? Right? And if you think about it, I'm sure you can think of many heteronormative examples in our modern society. I mean, heteronormativity is set up before kids are out of diapers. We often act as if little baby boys are flirting with women, while we'll say even grosser things like, you need to lock up your daughter when she grows up. Ew, right? It's a baby. It's so gross. This is particularly problematic in a rape culture where we blame victims of sexual assault for their actions instead of blaming the assaulting rapists. Another thing is your right to be married is never questioned if you're heterosexual. Even the whole you may now kiss the bride thing, right? All of weddings are so heteronormative. The father gives the daughter away. Do you wear a tux? Do you wear a dress? All of these heteronormative assumptions are then applied to same-sex couples as if one has to be one and the other to fit that heteronormative binary. Heteronormativity also has darker sides than wedding customs. Many people are harassed, assaulted, discriminated against, or have to fear violence because of their sexual orientation or gender identity or gender expression. So Alfred Kinsey was among the first to conceptualize sexuality on a continuum rather than a strict dichotomy of gay or straight. And he created this 6-point rating scale that ranges from exclusively heterosexual to exclusively homosexual. The book touches on this a little bit, but I really have to underscore how important Kinsey was at that time period. He did this really comprehensive, the most comprehensive sexual study that was done at that time in the 1950s. And that's a time period we think of as Leave It to Beaver and I Love Lucy and this kind of like idyllic, MAGA kind of white picket fence whiteness time period. But in reality, what Kinsey found in his research is that a lot of people fell somewhere in that spectrum between heterosexuality and homosexuality. So instead of saying, you're exclusively in this binary, some of the questions would basically on that scale would be, have you ever had any same-sex interest or attraction? Have you actually acted on that? and to what extent you have, right? With basically kind of showing that we like to fit people into boxes in a binary in our society, but when it comes to actual desire, when it comes to our own internalized sense of sexual identities, these things are way more complex than this or that. Even in the 1950s, the time periods where like your grandparents were having sex, or, earlier, we tend to think of like our own time period as the only one that has sexual autonomy or any sort of understanding of those things. But again, we wouldn't be here today if not for the sexuality of previous generations. So Eve Sedgwick basically expanded on Kinsey's notions of this, kind of range of sexuality instead of a binary. And she coined the term homosocial to oppose homosexual, describing non-sexual same-sex relations. Sedgwick recognized that in U.S. culture, males are subject to a clear divide between the two sides of this continuum, where females enjoy more fluidity. So this can be illustrated in the way that women are allowed to express more what's called homosocial feelings. So like a non-sexual regard for people of the same sex. So women are allowed to hug each other, hold hands, have physical closeness, you go to the bathroom together. Those kind of cliches, right? That when women have friendships with each other, they're allowed to like share the same bed, like to do things that would definitely not be okay for US males, right? US males have to refrain from those expressions because they violate heteronormative expectations that male sexual attraction should be exclusively for females. So men aren't, again, allowed to hug each other as much, hold hands, have that physical closeness. What's interesting about that, just side note from Sedgwick for a minute, is that it tends to be that you can do this within a sports context. When you're in a kind of large fraternal culture, like you can smack each other on the butt on the field, right? Or, kind of have those moments. This whole nother argument is that sometimes men will drink too much so that they can have those times where they hug each other, I love you, man, kind of thing, because they're really being told by society that they're not allowed to express those things. Or even there's this notion of saying that you like, your friend, or you love your friend or care for your friend, but then literally in that same breath saying no homo. This idea of trying to maintain this heteronormative kind of, lens so that they're not violating social norms. So research shows that it's easier for women to violate the social norms around homo kind of, social activities rather than men, because men are subject to more social disapproval for being physically close to other men. All right, moving on to heterosexism. Much of the discrimination that we have in society is really based on stereotypes and misinformation. Some of this is based on heterosexism, which is an ideology and a set of institutional practices that privileges heterosexuals and heterosexuality over other sexual orientations. So just like racism or sexism, heterosexism is a systematic advantage embedded in our social institution. So those who are heterosexual get these advantages, right? Meaning the social institution is stuff like the example of marriage again. Not having to question whether you're going to be legally allowed to be married, whether the Supreme Court will just decide, nope, you can't get married anymore. Things like that. Versus, if you're of any other sexual orientation than heterosexual, then you face a systematic disadvantage in those social institutions that offers powers to people that conform to a heterosexual orientation while simultaneously disadvantaging those who don't. Homophobia is similar. So that it's a little bit different than heterosexism. Heterosexism is more built into the institutions, versus homophobia is an extreme or irrational aversion to homosexuals. And this accounts for further stereotyping and discrimination. Similar to homophobia is transphobia, a fear, hatred, or dislike of transgender people, and or prejudice and discrimination against them by individuals or institutions. So over time, advocates for LGBTQ equity have won many legal victories, such as overturning Don't Ask, Don't Tell. That was, kind of in the military, you could serve, but you weren't allowed to talk about your sexual orientation. Challenging the Defense of Marriage Act that basically opened the path for same-sex marriage. And just recently, what was that, last year before? Oh, all the years just fly by. I can't keep it straight anymore. It was very recent court case basically provided an expansion to workplace protections to also protect same-sex couples or same-sex identifying individuals from being fired because of their sexual orientation. It's pretty wild to think that up into the 2020s that you could go get married, have a gay marriage on Saturday, and then go back to work on Monday and be fired for being gay. So that's pretty remarkable that that was just changed recently. So we see that these are ongoing issues. Okay, moving on to gender roles. The term gender role refers to society's concept of how men and women are expected to look and how they should behave. These roles are based on norms or standards created by society. In U.S. culture, masculine roles are usually associated with strength, aggression, and dominance, while female roles are associated with passivity, nurturing, and subordination. So how do we know how these things work? Well, part of it's through role learning, right? This starts at birth, basically. Well, actually, technically a little bit before that. Even in the womb, we apply a lot of gendered norms. But anyway, we'll just skip that. So basically, by the time you're born, right, you are put in a blue outfit or pink outfit. I remember a friend of mine, her kid just did not grow hair for a long time, and so she'd always put a bow on her because people would say, oh, what a cute little boy. And somehow misgendering her baby was very upsetting. And you're like, it's a baby. It just like cries and craps and eats. Like that's all it does. It doesn't really have a firm gender identity yet that's going to be offended by that, right? But it's more for the adults than for the children when it comes to those kind of gendered aspects. So how do we learn these things? Part of it's through play, right? One way we learn is, typically our parents will supply us with toys that may or may not be pretty gender specific, right? Meaning boys will often be given trucks or toy guns, superhero paraphernalia, like active toys that promote motor skills, aggression, and solitary play, right? Or even like building things like Legos and stuff like that. Well, daughters are often given dolls and dress-up apparel that fosters nurturing, social proximity, and role play. So studies have shown that children will most likely choose to play with gender-appropriate toys or same-gender toys, even when cross-gender toys are available, because parents give children positive feedback in the form of praise or, involvement or physical closeness when they're causing or when they're actually showing gender-normative behavior. So I put a video in your additional resources for this week from Feminist Frequency about gender in kids commercials, TV commercials. And I think this is like the best way to illustrate what I'm talking about here. That they can take the same product, right? Like a Power Wheels car. And for a boy, it's like, this is a Power Wheels jumbo whatever. And it's like in camouflage and like explosions are going off like it's a Michael Bay film. And then they take the same thing and they make it for girls. They cover it in pink and they're like, Barbie drives you to school, blah, 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 right? And they have this very incredibly gendered notion, even though it's the exact same toy. One is just pink and the other one's camo, right? But the way in which we apply the gender notions to it really shapes children. Children are really soaking these things up. And they're very, very impressionable. So please watch that video and the additional resources. It's very entertaining. And then, of course, adult jobs, right? This whole point of why do we play in these very different ways? Well, it kind of reflects the ways in which we work as adults in very gender-segregated industries, right? So this drive to adhere to masculine and feminine gender roles continues later in our lives. Men tend to outnumber women in professions such as law enforcement, the military, and politics, while women tend to outnumber men in care-related occupations, such as childcare, healthcare, of course, in that term we mean mostly nursing, and social work. So these occupational roles are examples of typical U.S. and male and female behaviors derived from our cultural traditions. Adherence to them demonstrates fulfillment of societal expectations, but not necessarily of personal preference, meaning sometimes people want to step outside of those boundaries. And again, take my gender class, we'll talk all about that. There are so many ways we police people back into what we consider the appropriate social roles for them. So for adult jobs, for example, you can tell that an adult job is gendered just by if you have to use a gendered moniker. So if you say, oh, he's a male nurse, then the assumption of nurse is female. So that's why you have to say male. Or she's a female pilot, right? If the assumption of pilot is male, then you have to say female first. So in many ways, our adult jobs are very segregated, which leads to a lot of the issues of, the actual pay gap, which we'll talk about later. Okay, gender identity is a person's deeply held internal perception of their gender. Individuals who identify with a gender that's different from their biological sex are called transgender. And transgender is not the same as homosexual. Many homosexual males view both their sex and gender as male. So people conflate sex and gender as the same thing when they're not. So while determining the size of the transgender population is difficult, it's estimated that 2 to 5% of the US population is transgender. So gender dysphoria is a topic that often comes up when it comes to discussions of transgender identities. And just to preface, we have been medicalizing sexuality since the 1800s, right? Western society is so weird about sex. We're like, let's go into a laboratory and understand it, right? Instead of like the more kind of like approach of what is sex, how does it feel, what can we do to make this more enjoyable, pleasurable, consensual, things like that, like more Eastern philosophy way. In the Western world, sex is all about a laboratory, right? Even the term heterosexual and homosexual came out of medical literature in the late 1800s. And it's funny that the term heterosexual, when it was first introduced, was considered a bad thing, right? Because the idea was people were just not supposed to have sexual desires at all during the Victorian era, because that was like gross and uncouth and made you like an animal. So even someone that was considered heterosexual was deviant. But now heterosexual is like the norm, right? And homosexuality, again, comes out of those medical textbooks of the 1800s. Pretty wild stuff. Anyway, I just feel like it's important to preface the historical nature of that before we talk about medicalizing sexuality and gender. Like, people used to literally be put into institutions for having mental disorders for being homosexual, right? The DSM didn't take out homosexuality as a mental disease until the 70s. So obviously that made its way into the institutions, that embedded itself within medicine. And so that really affects the way people then can interpret, the reality of people in their everyday lives. So gender dysphoria is a condition of people whose gender at birth is contrary to the one they identify with. And to be at full dysphoria is different than just being non-binary or finding, senses of gender to be constricting, because gender is constricting to all of us, no matter what your gender identity is. The idea of a binary puts us all in a box and often leaves people completely outside of those boxes. And so dysphoria is just basically a whole different threshold of, this kind of intensity of feeling, that somehow your biological sex is just not at all going to be connected to how you feel as your gender identity. Another important topic when talking about transgender community is pronoun usage, right? These play a role in people's identities, and pronouns are just, again, used in place of proper nouns, such as your name. So in language like English, pronouns are very gendered. So meaning, we have he, him, his, she, hers, right? And this binary system excludes those who identify as neither male nor female. So they and other pronouns are often used to reference those who don't identify as male or female on that spectrum of gender identities. So to create language outside of a binary is important to kind of show that people exist outside of that binary, or that binary. Gender inclusive language is an important step in recognizing and accepting those whose gender is not man or woman. So meaning people that are gender nonconforming, gender neutral, gender fluid, gender queer, or non-binary, right? Go beyond the scope of what we even have language to explain, right? So it's important to have that language available so that people can then find and better have a clearer sense of their own identities. Okay, so when looking at gender and socialization, children learn at a young age that there are distinct expectations for boys and girls. Cross-cultural studies reveal that children are aware of gender roles by age 2 or 3. At 4 or 5 years old, most children understand culturally appropriate gender roles. And again, how do they get these roles? They get them through socialization. So part of what we learn through that socialization is sexism, which refers to prejudiced beliefs that value one sex over another. It varies in its level of severity. In parts of the world where women are strongly undervalued, young girls may not be given the same access to food, healthcare, or education as boys. Also, they'll grow up believing that they deserve to be treated differently than boys. While it's illegal in the United States, when practiced as discrimination, unequal treatment of women continues to pervade social life. It should be noted that discrimination based on sex occurs at both the micro and macro levels. Many sociologists focus on discrimination that's built into the social structure, known as institutional discrimination, because this has far, or wide-reaching impacts. So who's doing this socialization? It's our agents of socialization. Gender socialization occurs through four major agents: family, education, peer groups, and the mass media. Each agent reinforces gender roles by creating and maintaining normative expectations for gender-specific behaviors. Exposure also occurs through secondary agents such as religion, or workplaces, or the media, right? Things like that. Repeated exposure to these agents over time leads men and women into a false sense that they're acting naturally rather than following a socially constructed role that's been given to them. So family is the first agent of socialization. There's considerable evidence that parents socialize sons and daughters differently. So, typically girls are able to act more masculine, while boys are not allowed to act very feminine. And why? Because it doesn't challenge the hierarchy of society that says men are above women. If girls decide to be tomboys or be very athletic or, wear more kind of masculine clothing, they're not really challenging the hierarchy of society that says men are above women. But if men decide to be more effeminate, to wear makeup, to paint their nails, to wear dresses, things like that, they are then going down the hierarchy in society and therefore exposing what's supposed to be invisible, this invisible hierarchy that we all just kind of assume is true. So oftentimes boys and men are really not given as much ability to express themselves as women are. But again, different socialization results in different privileges for sons. They get greater privileges in autonomy and independence at earlier age than daughters. They may often be given fewer restrictions on what they wear, right? So it's not like, as they're leaving the door that day. Because again, what happens to girls is we sexualize them. We apply what's happening outside in the outside world and assume that others are going to see them as sex objects, right? So we're very, we don't send boys home often from school about what they're wearing, but if a girl shows her shoulders, it's like, you can't sit in class like that. You're going to be too alluring to the other students, which again, is just really just sexualizing the children when school should really just be about learning, right? Same thing when it comes to fewer restrictions on dating habits or curfews. Sons are often given, free rein from a lot of that stuff. And sons are also not expected to do as much domestic work at home, like cooking or cleaning or other household tasks that are considered feminine. And daughters are often limited by the expectations that they might be passive and nurturing, obedient, and typically take over a lot of domestic responsibilities, such as gendered chores or sometimes, caretaking of younger siblings is, often falls to females within the family. Education is another important agent of socialization. So the reinforcement of gender roles and stereotypes continues once a child reaches school age. Until very recently, schools were rather explicit in stratifying boys and girls. Girls were encouraged to take home economics or humanities courses, and boys were encouraged to take math and science courses. Historically, even the first college tracks that existed for women were finishing schools, where women could learn to sew and other crap like that, while, all the stuff they could learn to be stuck at home. So gender socialization still occurs in schools today, but in less obvious forms. Teachers may not even realize that they're acting in ways that reproduce gender-differentiated behavior patterns. Yet anytime they ask students to arrange themselves by gender, they're asserting that boys and girls are different. Even in kindergarten, schools subtly convey these messages to girls, indicating that they're less intelligent or less important than boys. For example, in a study of teacher responses to male and female students, data indicated that teachers praised male students far more than female students. Teachers interrupted girls much more often and gave boys many more opportunities to expand on their ideas. So in social and academic situations, teachers have traditionally treated boys and girls in opposite ways, reinforcing a sense of competition rather than a sense of collaboration. Boys are also permitted a greater degree of freedom to break the rules or commit minor acts of deviance, whereas girls are expected to follow the rules carefully and adopt a much more obedient role. So this means we excuse bad behavior from boys. Boys will be boys. And we react very negatively to bad behavior from girls. Peer groups are another very important influence. They reinforce what's socially expected on us and expect us to perform our gender in ways that are socially, acceptable to our peers. Peers may even bully each other into performing appropriate gender roles. And then, of course, the mass media serves as another significant agent of gender socialization. In television and movies, women tend to have less significant roles and are often portrayed as wives or mothers. When women are given a lead role, it often falls into one of two extremes: a wholesome saint-like figure or a malevolent hypersexual figure. The same inequality is pervasive in children's movies. Also, when you look at TV commercials and other forms of advertising, it often reinforces inequality and gender-based stereotypes. I'm going to have a whole video for you about that. Women are almost exclusively presented in ads promoting cooking, cleaning, and childcare-related products. Think about the last time you saw a man star in a dishwasher or laundry detergent commercial. You just didn't. In general, women are underrepresented in roles that involve leadership, intelligence, or a balanced psyche. Of particular concern is the depiction of women in ways that are dehumanizing, right? So in a lot of mainstream advertising, there's themes not just of hypersexuality, but violence, right? So I put in your additional resources a video by this advertising scholar, Jean Kilbourne, that talks about the dangerous ways that ads see women. And again, she's got jokes. She brings the jokes. I'm warning you on that one. Her wit is sharp. But she really does have a very clear point about how pervasive and how problematic these ads are, and how all of us tend to think that somehow we are exempt. Like you could see somehow thousands of these ads every year and be like, nah, they don't affect me. But her point is that these things are quick, cumulative, and subconscious largely. So in many ways, even if we're like the most woke, the most knowledgeable, the most whatever, we're still absorbing these messages from society over and over and over and over, which affects our internalized senses of, what's normal and our own gender identities. Okay, so looking at social stratification and inequality. Stratification is just a system in which groups of people experience unequal access to social resources. So gender stratification, is a problem that we really face in the US. Just like we have stratification by income, race, all these other things, we also have gender stratification. So this is visible in the economy, despite making up about half of the workforce. Men outnumber women in authoritative, powerful, and high-earning jobs. Even when a woman's employment status is equal to a man, she generally will make only 77 cents for every dollar made by her male counterpart. Women in the paid labor force also do the majority of unpaid work at home, what we call the second shift, right? Meaning, on an average day, 84% of women, compared to 67% of men, spend time doing household management activities. So women go to work, but then they come home and they're still expected to cook dinner, to clean, to take care of the kids, and take the primary share of that responsibility. Or it could be things like taking care of other family members or any of those kind of things. It's really often put on the backs of women. And again, not to get super anti-capitalist here, but that's kind of because of capitalism. Capitalism relies on unpaid labor of women. Think about it, right? If two people are working, who cleans? Who cooks? Who does any of that? Well, the whole notion of this kind of process really often relied on women's unpaid labor at home. So now the fact that wages remain stagnant since the 70s and women have largely entered the workforce almost to the same level as men, we know that, there's still someone's got to do it, right? And so rich people, they just pay a person, right? They pay a maid and a nanny and this and that, and someone just does all the labor for them, right? But for the rest of us, we have to negotiate and navigate these problems of, who's going to do the lion's share of the work when these things can be treated more equitably. And in recent generations, they are being done a lot more equitably. than in generations past. Also, the division of labor is important. So gender stratification through the division of labor is not exclusive to the US. The kinds of jobs might not be the same, but the pattern of gender segregation is notable in many societies. In the book, they talk about Murdoch's examination of the division of labor among 324 societies around the world, and he found in nearly all cases the jobs assigned to men were given greater prestige. So really, it's about who does the job, who they are, affects our perception of it. Just in the same way when we talked about deviance, who commits the crime affects our perception of if it's a crime or not. In the same way, who's doing a job affects how much prestige or credibility we give to that job. So then gender stratification in the US is a big problem. Even if the types of jobs are very similar and the differences are slight, men's work is still considered more vital. There's a long history of gender stratification in the US. When looking in the past, it would appear that society's made a lot of progress, right? Because we've gotten rid of a ton of these more blatant forms of gender inequality. So before 1809, women couldn't execute a will. Before 1840, women were not allowed to own and control their own property. This is why women often wrote books under pseudonyms, right? Because you not only could you not own property, you couldn't own intellectual property, meaning your own thoughts, because you didn't have them because you were a woman, right? So anyway, basically, they had to write under names that sounded kind of male so that people would be like, oh, this man got some good ideas. Before 1920, women were not allowed to vote. Before 1963, employers could legally pay a woman less for the same exact job. And before 1973, and now in 2022, women do not have a right to a safe and legal abortion. I put a video in your additional resources about this as well, because unless you want it to go another hour, I cannot really get into that. Message me though. I'd love to talk to you about it. Okay. So let's talk about the theoretical perspectives on gender. Functionalism has provided one of the most important perspectives in, sociological research for the 20th century, and has been a major influence on research in the social sciences. So they looked at the family as integral, as, a really important component of society, because the gender roles that we get there and the fact that they're a primary agent of socialization is really impactful. So functionalists argue that gender roles were established well before the pre-industrial era, when men typically took care of responsibilities outside of the home and women took care of responsibilities domestically, in or around the home. And these roles were considered functional because women were often limited by the physical restraints of pregnancy or nursing and unable to leave the home for periods of time. Once established, these roles were passed on to subsequent generations and served as an effective means of keeping the family system functioning. Because remember, they're all about functions. But changes occurred in the social and economic climate in the US during World War II. Changes in the family structure also resulted from that. So a lot of women had to assume the role of breadwinner alongside the domestic role to stabilize a rapidly changing society. And when men returned from war and wanted to reclaim their jobs, society fell back into a state of imbalance because a lot of women did not want to forfeit those wage earning positions. And again, we're talking about a 20th, meaning 1900s, 20th century perspective on this. What's important to note is when we think about World War II and women entering the workforce, people have this false notion that women entered the workforce in World War II. Women were always in the workforce. Always. Especially poor women, especially immigrant women, especially women of color. They've always been in the workforce. Sometimes under the table, in these kind of, piecemeal ways on the side, but they've always been working. What happened during World War II that was different was women took over male jobs, male industries, right? So the whole Rosie the Riveter thing. What was the key to this was women were told, you can't do that job. You're not physically capable. And then when they were physically capable enough to do the job, it's really hard to put that back in the box, right? To say, well, no, you're not able to, because you can say, well, I just did for 2 years. I was clearly physically able to because I just did it. So that kind of set the groundwork for that second wave of the women's rights movement to come along, basically from the children of those women that were forced back into the home. Because again, once the cat was out of the box, it's really hard to get it back in, to say, no, you can't do that, when you're like, well, you just did though. We just saw it. Okay, moving to conflict theory. So conflict theory obviously takes a different perspective because they're looking at power differences. So according to conflict theory, society is a struggle for dominance over social groups or among social groups. So meaning, if we have hierarchies in society, then oftentimes these groups are pitted against each other, like women versus men. And you're competing for resources against each other. So when sociologists examine gender from this perspective, we can view men as the dominant group and women, or anyone who is any other gender identity, as the subordinate group. So according to conflict theory, social problems are created when dominant groups exploit or oppress subordinate groups. So if you think about the suffrage movement, should women be allowed to vote, right? Or again, this whole men getting to decide whether or not women have children, right? It's difficult for women to rise above men as a dominant group. Because again, the rules for how you would get opportunities in society are controlled by the dominant group, which is men. And if the social values say women aren't as smart, they're not as capable, they're not as whatever, that really affects our own individual perceptions of who is, who should be in those positions. So again, I included a video in your additional resources looking at the overturning of Roe v. Wade and the kind of social consequences this has, but not just for, women generally, but particularly for women of color and poor women who obviously, facing compounding marginalities in this intersectional lens are, much more likely to face death from Roe v. Wade being overturned. Meaning maternal mortality is incredibly high in some communities. And again, we'll talk more about this when we talk about healthcare, but because those things are unequal, the results are also unequal of these kind of changes in laws. Okay, so Engels was a German sociologist who studied family structure and gender roles. He was also the guy that was like BFF with Karl Marx. Side note. Engels suggested that the same owner-worker relationship seen in the labor force is also seen in the household, with women assuming the role of the proletariat. Because women's dependence on men financially for men to attain wages, made it so that women became dependent on their spouses for economic support. I mean, until even in the 1970s, you couldn't get a credit card without your husband signing off on it, right? And it's pretty interesting how, even the notion of how we date, or the idea that men should ask women out on a date, things like this, it all goes back to a historical time period when people moved to the cities and women were not able to control their wages. So they worked in factories, but if they were unmarried, their father controlled their wages. If they were married, their husband controlled their wages. So it makes sense that men had to ask women out on dates and had to pay for dates because women didn't have money. They couldn't control their own money. So, some of those things then stick in the culture because they get passed down generationally, and we lose that, why it happened in the first place. And we forget that, and we don't realize kind of how we've built upon that. We're like, why is it that women or that men are expected to pay and things like that? Well, I mean, even at this point, on average, they make, women make 77 cents to a male dollar. But of course, that's even further stratified when you look at these things intersectionally, meaning that, white women and Asian women make more like 78 cents. You have African American women making more around 64 cents. And Latinx women making more like 55 cents to that same male dollar. And even then, men of color such as Latinx or African American men often make less than white women or Asian women. So these things are more complex than this and that and the binaries that we tend to look at through society. Though this is an intro course and we barely scratch the surface, I just want to sprinkle in a little bit more of the complexity of actual life. Okay, so more contemporary conflict theories suggest that when women became wage earners, they gained power in the family structure and create more democratic arrangements in the home. Although they may still carry more of the domestic burden, right? They may still be expected to do more of the cleaning and the cooking and the child rearing, but the power dynamic of I control the money, I'm the king of the castle, what I say goes, changes because you're no longer the sole provider, right? And again, even in that model, from a male perspective, sure, it gives you power to be the sole provider, but then what happens when you lose your job? And what happens when everyone's depending on you with your one wage to support the entire family, to buy the house, to, buy the cars, to send the kids to college, to take care of everything. No one wins in that gender system. Okay, so looking at feminist theory. This is a type of conflict theory that examines inequalities and gender-related issues and uses a conflict approach to examine the maintenance of gender roles and inequalities. So radical feminism in particular considers the role of the family in perpetuating male dominance. In patriarchal societies, men's contributions are seen as more valuable than those of women. Patriarchal perspectives and arrangements are widespread and taken for granted. So as a result, women's viewpoints tend to be silenced or marginalized to the point of being discredited or not even considered valid. Okay, moving on to symbolic interactionism. They want to understand human behavior by analyzing symbols and interactions. So obviously that's pretty important to discussing gender. So symbols, meanings are attached to symbols. And these are also socially created symbols, right? Symbols are not just something we find out in nature. They're also not static, meaning they change. We act and we react to symbols, and they're assigned meanings. So really fun fact about that. When you think of high heels, what gender do you think of? High heels. Who wears high heels? Well, if you look at history, there's a really interesting history of high heels. The first real high heels that emerged were in the Persian army. It was considered the higher the heel, the more manly the man. Right? Interesting. And then King Louis IV of France basically took the heels from the Persian army and had even the highest heels and deemed it that no one could have higher heels than the king because he was the most masculine of all men. Right? And so what happened was, why did women start wearing high heels? They started wearing high heels because of the social prominence attached to high heels as masculinity. So as more and more women started wearing heels, the notion of it being masculine faded away, and it started becoming associated with femininity, which meant it was no longer valued in the same way. So it's pretty interesting when you think about it. Like, high heels are like, no, look, those are for women. But they didn't used to be, right? Like the old Persian army, old kings of France, things like that. It was completely equated with masculinity. So what does that show us? It just shows us these are symbols. They mean nothing. We attach meanings to them, and then they become meaningful. So doing gender is basically, it's kind of complicated. The idea of acting, right? That gender isn't just a thing that exists, it's something we do. So when people perform tasks or possess characteristics based on gender roles assigned to them, they're said to be doing gender. So whether we're expressing our masculinity or femininity, we're always doing gender. So gender is something that we perform, not something we are. So what are some examples of doing gender? What we wear, our hair styles, our nails, what we eat, what we drive, our body care rituals, so many things. I mean, how you sit, how you talk, how you walk, everything is gender. So, it just kind of shows how much these things are socially constructed. And then looking at the social construction of sexuality, both gender and sexuality are socially constructed. The social construction of sexuality refers to the way in which socially created definitions about the cultural appropriateness of sex-linked behavior shapes the way people see and experience sexuality. So, if you kind of think about this briefly, gender is not just a concept in a book, it's something we all experience every day. So consider the way you were socialized by your family. In what ways did your socialization conform to traditional gender roles? What toys did you play with? What activities were you encouraged to pursue? What household chores have you performed? And think about this too. Was that the same from your parents? Like, did they have the same kind of experience as you had? Or your grandparents? Or have those things changed quite a bit? Right? And if you think about that, you'll realize that, typically, we all do have different experiences. We're all individuals. But because of the power of these notions in society, it can really affect, the kind of experiences we have growing up. So biological determinism is basically the argument in society that preserves the binary that shouldn't exist. So sociologists challenge theories of sex, gender, and sexuality that link male and female behavior to biological determinism. So biological determinism is the belief that men and women behave differently because of differences in their biology. So again, what does it mean to be socially constructed? How can we show that it's not biological? Because gender means different things in different cultures. And because gender means different things at different times in history in the same culture. If it was all biological, it would be the same everywhere or close to it. And it's not by far. So we know these things are socially constructed. So when looking at sexual attitudes and practices, sexuality is viewed as a person's capacity for sexual feelings. Studying sexual attitudes and practices is a particularly interesting field of sociology because sexual behavior is a cultural universal. But how each society interprets sexual behavior or what is appropriate is very different. So it all comes down to norms, what's considered normal in that particular society based on the values of that culture. Societies that value monogamy, for example, would oppose extramarital sex. Individuals are socialized to sexual attitudes by their family, education system, peers, media, religion, and other groups. Historically, religion has been the greatest influence on sexual behavior in most societies, but in more recent years, peers and the media have emerged as two of the strongest influences, particularly among U.S. teens. When looking at sexuality around the world, cross-national research on sexual attitudes in industrialized nations reveals that normative standards differ across the world. This shows again that it's socially constructed. When looking at different industrialized nations, Sweden is thought to be the most liberal when it comes to attitudes about sex. They have very few regulations on sexual images in the media. They're much more open. Sex education starts around 6 years old and is compulsory as part of the school curriculum. So their permissive approach to sex has helped the country avoid some of the major social problems associated with sex, such as, their rates of teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases or infections are among the lowest in the world. So it appears that Sweden is a model for the benefits of sexual freedom and just teaching kids what's happening, right? And versus the way that sexuality in the U.S. happens, right? So the U.S. prides itself on being the land of the free, but it's pretty restrictive when it comes to attitudes about sex. U.S. culture is particularly restrictive when it comes to women and sexuality. It's widely believed that men are just more sexual than women, that women don't care about sex, that they don't want sex, when that's just not true. There's a popular notion that men think about sex every 7 seconds. Research, however, suggests that men think about sex an average of 19 times per day versus 10 times per day for women. So we're not talking about a huge difference there. Belief that men have or have the right to have more sexual urges than women creates a double standard. So, first of all, that basically says that, men need to have sex, want to have sex, so it's normal for them to be sexually aggressive, right? But saying that women aren't interested in it basically says that women are passive, that they don't want to have sex. And again, I don't know a nicer way to say this. It's a pretty rapey ideology that basically says men are supposed to be very aggressive. Women are supposed to be like, oh, I don't think so. And, the idea of consent gets very muddled in this whole process, right? So due to a double standard, a woman is likely to have fewer sexual partners in her lifetime than a man. But what's interesting about that too, side note, they don't talk about that in the book, is that when it comes to research, women tend to underreport how many sexual partners they have, and men tend to overreport how many sexual partners they have. Why? Because a woman is punished for having a lot of sex, especially when a lot of sexual partners, and a man is glorified for having a lot of sexual partners. So of course that, really structures how we understand sexuality very differently through that double standard. Again, a part of this, a huge problem is we don't have comprehensive sex education in schools in the U.S. Sex education is not required in all public schools. There's a lot of states that don't do this. And the heart of the controversy is, can we teach kids about sex because then they'll do it? When in reality, they're already going to have the hormones, they have the internet, right? The difference is, can we teach them in a way so that they're safer, more knowledgeable, more protected, and not vulnerable to all of the ills that come from this? So for instance, teaching comprehensive sex education that also includes information about, same-sex identifying and, queer individuals gives a roadmap for adult success. Meaning, a lot of you, if you have had sex education training in schools, they might have talked about maybe STDs, STIs, the reproductive process. Here's the ovaries, here's the fallopian tube, or you label like a cross-section of anatomy, because again, it's all about being in a laboratory in the West, right? But what they often don't teach is, what does consent look like? What is affirmative consent? Why is that important to clear sexuality, right? Or, what does dating violence look like? We know that the majority of dating violence actually happens in teenage couples. So why are we not teaching kids how to keep themselves safe, how to know what abuse looks like, right? So a lot of the things we're teaching in the sex education, or basically we're not teaching in the sex education that's being taught in other countries around the world, means that our children are just less safe, less knowledgeable, more likely to fall for, predators, more likely to end up with STDs and STIs, and more likely to end up as pregnant as teenagers. So when it comes to abstinence, much of the debate is about this, right? In 2005, there's research in the book, 15% of US respondents believe that schools should teach abstinence only. And at the time, I remember those years, there was a lot of pushback politically for an abstinence-only education system under, the Bush administration. And abstinence only just basically says, don't have sex. It doesn't provide children with, information about how to have safe sex, how to, any of these kind of other things. It's much more about just don't do it, right? Like a just say no approach to sex. And so that, of course, doesn't really, actually, when using abstinence-only programs, that tends to be when you see the biggest upticks in teen pregnancies. So it's kind of a non-controversy though, right? Because as much as, some people support abstinence-only education, that's only 15% of parents, when over 55% of parents think that teens should have really comprehensive information about sex. And 77% of parents think, that curriculum is good to teach kids about sex so that they can practice safe sex now and then in the future. So that Sweden example again, those comprehensive sex education programs in their public schools educate them about safe sex, and that can be a model for us for what we should be doing better. So the teenage birth rate in Sweden is 7 per 1,000 births, compared to 49 per 1,000 births in the US. Among 15 to 19-year-olds how many have reported cases of gonorrhea? In Sweden, it's nearly 600 times lower than in the United States. So, the argument there is that clearly the comprehensive sex education is at least informing children on how to understand when they grow into adulthood and they grow into that kind of, sexuality, how they can then, practice safe sex. So going on to sociological perspectives on sex and sexuality. Again, I don't know why this chapter is so long. They put two different chapters together, right? They put a gender and a sexuality chapter in a one chapter. So it's long as hell. I apologize. So basically, when it comes to sexuality, functionalists stress the importance of regulating sexual behavior to ensure marital cohesion and family stability. They see family as the most important part of society. So they maintain a strict focus on that at all times in their kind of like theoretical construction. So from a functionalist point of view, using good old Talcott Parsons, and remember, this is like an old dude that's been dead for a while. The purpose of encouraging sexual activity in the confines of marriage is to intensify the bond between spouses and ensure that procreation occurs within a stable, legally recognized relationship. So the structure gives offspring the best possible chance for appropriate socialization and the provision of basic resources. So from a functionalist standpoint, homosexuality was not something that they wanted to promote as a substitute for heterosexuality, because they're thinking, well, then people aren't going to have kids. And you're like, yeah, there's this thing called adoption. Not sure if you heard of it. So that would cause a dysfunction to society. But that criticism doesn't take into account the increasing legal acceptance of same-sex marriage, gay and lesbian couples choosing to bear and raise children through a variety of available resources. So basically, a lot of those functionalist arguments are from, again, the 1900s. Sociological perspectives on sex and sexuality, conflict theory. So again, conflict theory is always looking at power differences. From a conflict theory perspective, sexuality is another area in which power differentials are present and where dominant groups actively work to promote their worldview as well as their economic interests. So, these debates, when people are socially marginalized, the powerful get to decide what kind of rights these groups can have. So the book looked at debates over same-sex marriage and adoption rights for same-sex couples. And I think another one to highlight in more current debates is that Don't Say Gay bill in Florida that restricts what educators can talk about and include in the curriculum for young students. Right? Meaning, what if a student is gay and they go into class, they don't see their identity represented because you just can't talk about it? What if they have 2 moms or 2 dads and they're supposed to do a project on their family? Well, they're not allowed to talk about that because they're same-sex couples. So it basically just tries to erase the realities of the existence of same-sex couples. Also, there's other laws going into effect all over the country, challenging the rights of trans people, often targeting trans youth and gender-affirming care. And again, why is it called gender-affirming care? Why is it so important? It's life-saving. Meaning, children will kill themselves if they're not given gender-affirming care. And it's much better that someone slightly not fit into societal confines of what we consider gender appropriate than not be alive, right? But in some states, they are basically trying to pass laws, and some laws have been passed, to criminalize, even to the extent of taking children away from their parents if they're providing gender-affirming care. Or, basically putting parents in prison because they put their kid on hormone blockers. And we're not talking about surgery, right? Because again, children under 18 cannot have surgery for, their genitals in a transgendered fashion. The only thing that we're talking about is hormone blockers, that when you're given those before you hit, puberty, that can really help shape, not going through a lot of the physiological changes that are really going to put a trans person at odds with their own body and their own identity. So it's life-saving. It doesn't mean surgery. And it's all like the people making these laws don't understand these concepts. So it's just for them, they're punching down. They're picking one of the most marginal groups in society and targeting them, saying you can't play sports with these kids because you're not like these other kids. All these stupid things when it's like, these are children. These are just children that you're targeting and harming. Like, why? Why would anyone target and harm children? It's horrifying. And this really connects to the debate over teaching CRT, right, critical race theory, and trying to determine how we interpret history in our current circumstances. Why would we be threatened about teaching critical race theory? Critical race theory, all it's saying is that sometimes the laws are racist because of the way we view certain things in society. Racism has embedded itself in the legal structure as well as in other social institutions in society. That's just a fact. That's not controversial. But these talking head folks, especially on the political right of the spectrum, they don't even know what it is. You ask them, right? Like, what is that? Or in a similar fashion, these bathroom bills that were passed all over the country, trying to say that, if you're transgender, you can't go into the bathroom of the gender you identify with. You have to go into the bathroom of your biological sex at birth, which, again, makes no sense because you're socially living within that category. And how do we read gender? Do we look at everyone's genitals? We look at every single person's genitals we come across? No, we look at how they present themselves. We look at their hair, we look at their clothes, we look at the way they walk and talk, and that's how we determine gender. We never look at people's genitals. So what's happening there doesn't even matter for gender. And how do you even police a bathroom bill like that? You go to every bathroom, you put a cop outside, and you start checking people's genitals? I don't think so, right? And these are people who pretend they believe in limited government or small government, and they literally want the government to force you to give birth or force you to use a certain bathroom. You're just like, what? It doesn't make any sense. Right? Especially because the bathroom bill stuff, it's all predicated on these false notions that somehow transgender individuals are threatening to women or, going to harm women, which there's just no data to back that up at all. Right? Here's a fun fact. Anyone can walk in any bathroom at any time. Because the argument is, well, if we allow transgender people to walk into the bathroom that they choose, then some men are just going to put on a dress so they can go in a women's bathroom. Men just go in women's bathrooms all the time. Women are often assaulted, raped, hurt, beaten in women's bathrooms, not by trans people. And the fact that putting trans men in those situations is just horrifying, to have to go into the women's bathroom. And putting trans women inside of men's bathrooms means they are much more likely to face violence and brutality. Many people have been harmed, murdered, killed, threatened, beaten, all sorts of horrible things because of these kind of policies. So again, it's just really interesting to show how, like, as gender changes in society, the last throes of the power system before really tries so hard to hold on to that power by reinforcing these things through these laws. But they're draconian and they will break because gender isn't real. It's a thing we make up. Okay, so sociological perspectives on sex and sexuality. So symbolic interactionism, again, looks at how we interact with each other to make meaning. So they're looking at how meanings are associated with sexuality and sexual orientation. So since femininity is devalued in the US, those who adopt any sort of feminine traits are subject to ridicule, and this is especially true for boys or men. Just as masculinity is the symbolic norm, so too is heterosexuality come to signify normality. So, like I said, the American Psychological Association, before 1973, considered homosexuality to be abnormal or deviant behavior. And interactionist labeling theory says that the impacts of this are far-reaching beyond 1973. So before 1973, the APA was powerful in shaping social attitudes towards homosexuality by defining it as a pathological disease. Today, the APA says there's no association between sexual orientation and psychopathy. But it's too late. They already put that out there into society. And when these things get embedded within medical institutions or things like that, they just have a prevailing power. They have a sense that holds on for a lot longer than if just like some dude on the street corner saying it. Also, when looking at sexual minority groups, interactionists are interested in how discussions of homosexuals often focus exclusively on their sex lives, right? Versus, there's this assumption that especially men, homosexual men, are hypersexual or deviant. And it's really interesting, like, people basically associate homosexuals with their sex acts. So they'll say things like, oh, it's not appropriate to have a gay person teaching children because they're going to teach them to have sex, or that whole don't say gay thing, right? But talking about homosexual families is not the same about talking about the specific sex acts that any individual engages in. There's plenty of heterosexual people doing wild sex acts out there, right? These things are very diverse through individuals. But the idea is we equate people that are sexual minorities to the difference. And so they basically hype that up when you're really just looking at a couple like any other couple. So interactionism also might look at slurs that are used, like, different language and words that are used to describe sexual minorities. Turning to the looking glass self, recall Cooley's looking glass self we talked about a while back, right? That the self develops as a result of our interpretation of the responses of other people. So constant exposure to derogatory labels, jokes, pervasive homophobia, all the comments that Dave Chappelle keeps wanting to do about trans folks, right, leads to a negative self-image, or worse, even self-hate. The CDC reports that homosexual youths who've experienced high levels of social rejection are 6 times more likely to have high levels of depression and 8 times more likely to have attempted suicide. So queer theory is an interdisciplinary approach to sexuality studies that identifies Western society's rigid splitting of gender into that binary and questions the binary. They question, like, why have we taught kids to think about this in these weird ways? So their main arguments, or the perspective that they are arguing, highlights the need for more flexible and fluid conceptualization of sexuality that allows for change, negotiation, and freedom. So going back to Sedgwick, we talked about before, she was a queer theorist that argued against U.S. society's monolithic definition of sexuality and its reduction to a single factor, like what the sex is of the person you desire. So she said there's dozens of other ways in which people's sexuality is different, such as, even identical genital acts can mean very different things to different people. That sexuality makes up a large share of the self-perceived identity of some people and a real small share of other people's identities. Some people spend a lot of time thinking about sex, and others spend very little time thinking about sex. That these things are all in a continuum, and that people are individuals and not like groups that can put into easy little boxes. Some people have a lot of sex, some people don't. I mean, even to the nitty-gritty, some people like spontaneous sexual relationships or spontaneous situations. Other people like really predictable ones, right? That are, again, all of this stuff is it's varied between people, even if you're looking at only heterosexuals in that context. Some people, yeah, again, homo, hetero, bisexual, pansexual, whoever, experience their sexuality as deeply embedded in a matrix of gender meaning and gender differentials, and other people just don't. So using queer theory to understand these things is basically stepping back and looking at society as that outsider and trying to perceive and, understand how people experience sex, gender, and sexuality so that we can have kind of more clear understandings that are outside of our own bias of the culture to truly understand, what it is that is going on in society. So again, just as a brief wrap for the whole thing, it's just that these things are complex. And again, I teach an entire class on this, so it's hard to cram it into one lecture. But we're just scratching the surface here. And, watch the stuff in the additional resources for a little bit more information. And, we'll build upon this a little bit in future chapters. But this is a really essential one to understanding the kind of past, present, and future organization of these topics in society.